Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode number 81 of Office Hours. This is going to be a weird one. We're going to do a weird episode. So normally, this would be the part where I explain to you that in a given episode of Office Hours, what we do is I take 3 questions from you, my beloved audience, and I answer them. I pick them sometimes according to theme, sometimes completely at random, whatever. But today we're answering one question. Only one question. I'm going to spend the entire 40 minutes to an hour just talking about this one topic. Now, this topic is near and dear to my heart for many reasons. I've been running a ton of Dungeon World one-shots lately, and I have at least one and maybe more planned for the future. So we're going to be talking today about how to run a Dungeon World one-shot. We're going to talk about how to turn that one-shot into a campaign. If you do the one-shot and everybody loves it so much, they cannot part with their characters. And we're going to talk about using our time well. We're going to talk about asking good questions. But I didn't just decide to in the spirit of Office Hours, there's still a question. I still have a question. And this question came from a friend of mine. A friend of mine named Judd. So let's let Judd set it up for us, shall we?
Hey Adam, this is Judd, and I'm looking at Twitter and at your tweet about your campaign notes and how you made them during character creation, and they're enough to start a whole campaign. And I would love to see you walk through those and kind of talk about how you would turn those into a campaign, what questions you asked during character creation made those things happen, or how you set the tone and got everybody on the same page. All that would be wonderful. So I don't know if it's a question or a request, but I guess it's more of a question of how do you do that and set that up. I just think that'd be a really neat video to see. Thank you very much. Thanks for doing what you do. I really enjoy it.
No, thank you, Judd. So Judd is an old Burning Wheel fan and a friend of mine from way back. We are acquainted through the various internet subforums of that particular game. And I believe that Judd is either running or just finished running a game of Burning Wheel over on twitch.tv/actualplay. I think it was like a one-on-one game with Sean Nittner, I think. Anyway, so Judd asked this about a tweet that I posted related to a one-shot that I ran of Dungeon World for PureCon. So PureCon is a convention that I was at recently. Where I did several. I think we did 3 different Dungeon World one-shots. I did one with some of the organizers, which we'll talk about today. I did a charity game, and I did a live game on stage with a bunch of Polish GMs. And they were all great. I've run, if you watched Once More Into the Dungeon World, if you watched Dungeon World the Waypoint Dungeon World, if you've watched any of the Dungeon World streams that we did with the former Roll20 esports team, all of those things were run using the same principles. And I posted my campaign notes because I've been taking notes on my iPad. This was the iPad gesture. I've been taking notes on my iPad lately, and that makes them very, very easy to export. So I did the game. I did a page of notes. I exported them and I threw them up on Twitter to just be like, hey, this is how easy it is. And of course, Judd, being the excellent human being that he is, was like, no, you're not getting away with it that easy. You can't just post the notes and tell us this is all it takes. You need to explain yourself, Adam. So I'm going to take on Judd's challenge today. And we're going to talk about running Dungeon World as a one-shot and what I do to make that work. And as a reference, I'm going to pop up and we're going to leave here a copy of said notes. Now, if you can't read them because my writing is very small, that's okay. That's fine. You can find them on my Twitter. I will try to link them, these notes, in the YouTube description. But for now, this document is what we're talking about. I played a game of Dungeon World. This is a one-shot of Dungeon World at PureCon with three players and these are the notes that I took, leading me to play the game. So this is walking through character creation and creating the universe as we play the game. So let's talk a little bit about what the game itself demands, and we'll go through that process in Dungeon World, and we'll talk about a first session. Now, I had someone ask me at Office Hours Live, which is something that we did at PureCon. I had somebody ask me, hey, the game's book, right? The character creation and the pre-stuff in Dungeon World says you need to do some prep, or you can do some prep, right? Bring things to the table. And you know what? That's totally okay. You can do that. This is my specific style of Dungeon World prep. Now, prep and play in Dungeon World can adjust back and forth. I'm turning a knob, can adjust back and forth in terms of authority, right? So the GM can bring a lot to the table, and they can say, this is where you are, this is what the world is like, this is what elves and dwarves and halflings are, these are the important places and religions. Now make your character, right? Which is a very traditional way of approaching a game. You can do that if you want, or you can go all the way to the other end of the spectrum where I live, and you can bring nothing to the table. Now, there are advantages and disadvantages to each thing. We lay that out in the book a little bit. But for me, the reason why I like coming to the table with literally nothing prepared is so that I have, as the GM, nothing to protect, right? I have no protection for my ideas because I have no ideas. If I come to the table with a bunch of preconceived ideas of the universe, right? If I've done some prep, that can be good. It can be helpful, because starting from nothing is difficult, but in this case, for Dungeon World particularly, I really like to bring to the table a sense of curiosity more than anything else, so that when I ask a player a question and they give me an answer, I don't have to equivocate on that answer. I can take the answer for what it is, and I can apply it to the game's universe. If I come to the table with a bunch of preconceived ideas and somebody says something that contradicts one of those ideas, I might be tempted to ask them to change it. I might be tempted to have them adjust it. So coming to the table with an almost Zen-like sense of emptiness allows me to become a sponge for ideas, to rely on my inspiration rather than my preparation. So before we even go into character creation, what I like to do in a game of Dungeon World is clear my mind, right? Allow myself to act as recipient for ideas, right? Because that, to me, is the essence of game mastering, right? Is taking what your players give you and incorporating it into a meaningful whole, and then turning it back on them and watching them punish themselves. So I come to the table for character creation expecting nothing and trying to sort of free myself from any preconceived stuff. Now, this is hard because I have a lot of ideas, right? This is a thing that I do. I build up ideas and they accumulate in my brain, and I like to bring them to the table to play. But I have to actively combat that, at least initially, right? Keep those floodgates shut until such a point where you can use your own inspiration to build up on what the players are giving you. So there's a reason that we do character creation in the order that we do it in, right? And what I think is so important, and to me it feels like a truism, but it may not be to you. What I feel is a very true statement is that when the players in your game make choices, they're not just saying, I want to play this, right? They're not just saying, I want to be a wizard. They're not just saying, I want to be a halfling. They're saying to you, I, as a player, not as a character, but as a player in this game, I am interested in having things to say about wizards or halflings, right? I'm putting a stake in the ground and claiming this thing, at least in part, for my own, right? And the first step of character creation is choosing a class. And in this way, there is no overlap, right? So if you play a cleric in Dungeon World, you are saying to the group, I am interested in themes of religion, I'm interested in themes of service to power. I'm interested in themes of the gods. I'm interested in what religion looks like as it influences culture. I am interested in that kind of stuff in the game, right? And it's not just saying I want to be a cleric of the storm god. It's saying I'm interested in this part of the universe, and that's a huge, huge first step. So you can see in this group we have a bard, a druid, and a paladin, right? So we have a character who's interested in playing someone who is interested in or focused on purity, who is focused on authority, who wants to be seen as someone who is meant to be listened to, right? They're interested in those kinds of things in the game. We have a character who is tied to nature, who is tied to fluidity, right? Someone who's interested in being flexible, who's interested in exploring the natural world of our campaign. And then we have a bard, and bards are about social connection and NPCs, right? So already you can start to figure out what this campaign is going to care about based on the choices that the players have made. Class choice is so important, and that's why it's first, and that's why you cannot overlap them. Now, when people, obviously you can mess with the game however you like. It's Dungeon World. It's meant to be hacked. And a basic hack is allowing people to play the same class. But it's going to be very difficult if you have like 3 wizards to immediately wring some depth out of those choices. It functionally makes the choices slightly diluted. What you're basically saying is if you have 2 people playing the same class, they both have to collaborate on that thing. And that collaboration is a big part of what the next choice is. So choosing your character's race isn't just about, I want to have pointy ears and see in the dark. It's about getting to determine those characters' cultures. And classes, they're unique, but race overlaps in a bunch of places. So you might have 2 humans and an elf, right? You might have all 3 humans. You might have a dwarf, an elf, and a halfling, right? With no humans at all. So when you start making these choices, when your players and as the group start making these choices, they're doing the same things they do in class, right? You're listening to them make choices about what they want to say in the world. And I encourage the players at this point not to think too much about what those things mean, right? Because this isn't just species, it's species and culture. Right? So you're getting to say not only biologically what are dwarves like, but what is dwarven culture like? And my favorite thing about this is when there is overlap, right? When there are 2 characters who are both elves, when we go around and we do the introductions and I start asking questions from one character about elves, I'll actually be looking for reactions from the second player who's also an elf. So if I say to Dave, all right, Dave, tell me about elves. And Dave says, all elves are short-lived and violent. I will look at Blue Jay, who is also playing an elf, to see what faces Blue Jay makes. So if Blue Jay looks like excited about that, I will usually ask, cool, okay, so tell me a little bit more about that, right? Other player. Or if Blue Jay looks like that doesn't sound right, or that doesn't sound like my idea of elves, I'll say, is that true? Are all elves like that? Because maybe they're not. Maybe only Dave's character comes from a culture of elves that are violent. Maybe there's a split. Maybe there's division. Because division and splits, those things are positive for your game, right? Part of what you're looking for as you travel through the character creation process and you build this world for your one-shot, because you have nothing to begin with, if you're using the Adam Coble one-shot approach, registered trademark of the Adam Coble Broadcast Corporation. But if you come to the table with nothing and your players say things that don't align, this can feel awkward, right? Like you want these moments, but if you're not used to them, you can be blindsided. If a player says this is true and somebody else says, wait a second, no, that's not true, and they disagree, that's good. That's very, very good. You want that because that disagreement can create tension, and tension is what creates interesting gameplay. So choosing your characters as a group, choosing your character's race, choosing your character's race, which is to say their culture and their species, creates the very first moment of tension. Also keep an eye on what is or isn't in the universe, right? If you have human, elf, dwarf, does that mean there's nothing else? Are there halflings? Are there orcs? Right? What other races, cultures, and species might exist if those things are left off. Because if they're left off, that's the player saying to you, we're not interested in those. You can have them if you want, right? That becomes your responsibility to make that move, to create or not create them as you go, right? So this is where you can start to find bits and pieces of the world to put your own stamp on, where the players leave room for you. In a lot of ways, you're kind of being inversely authoritarian here, where you're letting the players make choices, and then the gaps they leave in their map, their building of the universe, you get to make that choice. So name and look, they're really just a way to help the players solidify what an elven wizard might look like and might be named. The first advanced version of Dungeon World that anybody approaches, the first hack anyone does, is choosing a name that's not on the list and choosing a look that's not on the list. This was a weird thing in development because people were very angry that we would dare give them a list and put a rule in the game that they had to choose from, right? Because technically, you are not playing by the rules of Dungeon World if you make a character whose name is not on the list. And that's very, very intentionally a choice. That is our first place where we nudge people towards saying, wait a second, I can hack this game. I can do something else. So we give them the opportunity to choose a name and choose their look because it's a way to reflect on what would an elven wizard look like? What would a human paladin look like, right? You'll notice, unless it's something reflective of their character, I don't really take notes about what the character looks like. Because I honestly don't really care. Now, I made a note. Now, this isn't to say that I don't, like, the universe won't care, but it's not that important to me, right? When people start asking me about the universe, I'm not going to be like, well, you know, Deminor the druid, described himself as being particularly handsome, right? Like that's not super important to me. But you'll notice I did take some notes about what was important, right? How, like, Lux, the paladin, is a fanatic, and that fanaticism is reflected by a glow in his eyes and a star tattooed on his forehead, right? Lux was giving me more information than, like, this was not an average human thing. This set Lux apart. In the same way that Oscar was well-fed, smiling, and jovial, which was a big contrast to Deminor and Lux. And so I made a note of that because I knew that it would be something that I could draw on later. But for the most part, you'll notice, like, I don't write down everything they wrote from their looks, because that's for them. That's for the players to envision both themselves and each other, and to give them a wall to push against to see if they do. So they do stats, they figure out modifiers. I definitely don't write down or care about that stuff. Maximum HP, same thing. I let them choose their starting moves sort of in isolation. I try not to explain more than what's on the book. So when you choose your starting moves, this is the first part where at the table, everybody kind of goes quiet. This is the first real homework that people have to do, right? So they have to choose. If you're a thief, you're done already, right? You pick one thing, but a druid has to choose where they're from. The paladin has to choose their quest. The bard has to figure out what their specialty is. And I do not ask about this now. And when they ask questions, I will try to reduce the amount of overall answering that I do. And I definitely don't do follow-up on these, right? Not now. Because the idea is that the information that you get is on the sheet. The sheet is enough to make that choice. And then we'll fill in the decisions later and what they mean in the fiction. I explain alignment. Characters choose those as well. They do gear. And then we get to the most important part. And this is the thing. The first 10 steps of character creation, I would say would take maybe like 15 minutes at most. In a one-shot, let's talk about time. So I try really, really hard in a one-shot of Dungeon World to do character creation on stage, right? On screen, on stream, either in a Patreon video if we're doing it for roleplay or live as part of the episode. Because I think that you can run, and I've done it before, you can run a solid one-shot of Dungeon World doing character creation, and gameplay in like 2 hours. I wouldn't do a one-shot shorter than 2 hours, but 2 hours is enough time to create characters, build the universe, and play the game. And we'll talk about moving from character creation into play in just a minute. But the first 15 to 20 minutes of character creation should be the first 10 steps, all the player homework, the very beginnings of things. There's no world really. We've got a couple of characters that exist in a vacuum, and the next step, step 11, introduce your character, is the most important step. This is the big bit. So I'll get to 10. I'll say, okay, we're going to introduce our characters, but before we do that, look at your bonds. You have to fill in one bond, but you can fill in all of them if you want, and you're going to listen. Your job, while the other players are talking, your job is to listen to them. And we're going to spend the next hour or 2 hours or 3 hours, however much time we have after character creation, playing out the game. But your job right now, when it's your turn to speak, is to introduce your character and to answer my questions. If you are not answering my questions, your job is to pay attention. And I make sure that everyone is done with their character creation up to this point. Do not start this section until you get everyone finish the first 10 steps. Because this is super important. Paying attention, listening, giving a shit about what everybody else is saying. So the reason that we do this, the reason we introduce, then we do bonds, is that you need the information in the introduction to be able to adequately prepare your characters, right? To finish doing bonds. So, introductions. This is where you get to start GMing. This is where we start asking questions and we really start building the world. Everything else I have on this sheet, everything else on my prep, comes directly from the questions that I ask. So the basic stuff you absolutely need to ask is, what is your character's name? What is their class? What is their race, right? Start that to remind them, which is why all of my notes are in the order that we put them in, right? The characters are a bard, a human named Oscar, right? A paladin, human named Lux, the druid, an elf named Deminor. So those are the base details. You can get them to describe their character's look. And then you need to ask them questions related to the character, to each other, and to the world. So those are the layers, right? So the first layer we look at, I don't have a lot of room here. My notes are in the way. The first layer we look at is answering things about the character. This is what the players need to choose their bonds. We want to ask them about things they share, right? Things that are related to each other. So if you have a paladin and a cleric, you want to talk about religion, get both the players in on that. If you have two elves, ask them about being elves, right? And then lastly, things for you to build the session on. This is your time. If you rush the introductions, or if you don't ask enough or the right questions, you're going to come out the other end not being prepared for the next hour or hour and a half or 2 hours that you need to run, right? This is your time to build things that you can create conflict out of. So let them introduce their character. Ask them for information that will help them play their character based predominantly on the stuff we know about them already, right? So this is when you can ask things like, you're the only elf in the party. Are elves rare? Right? I noticed there are 2 elves in the party, but only 1 human, right? This is a common GMing trick where I use the party as a microcosm of the universe, right? So generally, unless the party all agree as part of character creation that they are somehow different from the rest of the world, my base assumption is what we see in the party is what we can expect to see in the world. 2 humans and an elf. There are elves in the world, and they are outnumbered by humans. And then I'll ask, right? Start with that assumption, and then ask. And you might learn that, no, this elf is just rare in the party, but that there are more elves in the world than there are humans. Right? This is a way to start building the character as a representation of the greater universe around them. So you're going to ask them about their class, right? So this is when you can confirm with them that they are interested in things about the world, right? So the easiest one, for me at least, is clerics and paladins, because that's the stuff I tend to be drawn towards. But you can ask about what kind of social connections do they have in the greater universe, right? Are you, Lux, the paladin, are you part of an order? And you'll hear me ask this a lot, right? Are you part of an order, paladin? Are there a circle of druids, druid? Did you learn your bardic skills at a college, bard? Right? Do you belong to an adventurer's guild? Do you belong to a thieves guild? What larger social structures do you belong to? Because that's how you start to build a world. And if a character says yes, then ask follow-up questions, right? Say, how are you different from your order? How are you the same? What do you agree with that they do? What do you disagree with? Why are you not with them? Why are you with these people? How have you left that space behind? Because this is a good way for you to build past for your character. So organizations, cultures, larger structures they belong to, religions, colleges, whatever, and then find individuals within those spaces. I will ask players a lot, where did you learn to special ability, right? How did you learn to shapeshift? Where did you get your divine authority from? Who is your boss? Okay, now there's a person, right? Do you have any rivals in this organization? Who is someone that you have not seen in a long time? I like to ask too, at least once of a character in the party. I'll usually ask, what did you leave behind and what did you take with you? Those are questions that can help you bring the world into play, right? So I think the main thing that you want to do here for your own benefit as a GM is not only start to build a world, because having bardic colleges and having religions and having all of this very traditional campaign setting style stuff, it's not that useful. Like I don't care about two countries existing. I want tension. So I'll drive the questions towards that tension. I will say, for example, all right, you're from Clorthonia and you're from Barginia, and they're bordering countries. What do Clorthonia and Barginia argue about? What do they fight about, right? Is there a peace? If so, has it always been that way? How do they earn this peace? At what cost? And then tie it directly to the players. Right? Give them a reason to be either directly or indirectly part of that conflict. And if you ask a question that your players don't have an answer to, if they say, I don't know, or I hadn't thought about it, you can follow up by saying, does anybody else have an idea? Right? And don't just ask the group at large, but pick someone who is peripherally related. So if you say to the paladin, you worship the god of light, right? What church is most closely connected to the god of light? And if Lux says, I don't know, you can turn to another character like Oscar and say, Oscar, what stories have you heard about the god of light and their enemies, right? And that god's enemies or friends, right? And maybe that character will jump in, right? You can ask another character for their character's perspective. And this is an old characterization trick that I think I stole from Vampire. So in Vampire, every clan in their clan description has what they think of the other clans. And so sometimes it's fun to ask a Tremere, tell me about Clan Tremere, but sometimes it's more fun to ask the Brujah, right? Hey, Brujah, what do you think about Clan Tremere? What does your clan think? Right? And so you can jump ahead, right? We can only do these characters one at a time, but if a player doesn't have an answer, you can ask another player, and if nobody at the table cares, that is a golden opportunity for you to create tension, right? So if I ask the paladin, Lux, tell me about your church's greatest enemy, and Lux's player says, oh, you know what? I hadn't thought about it. Doesn't matter to me. And Deminor and Oscar both don't have any ideas. Now I get to add something. And this is when I can open those floodgates a little bit and let some of my own stuff in. And I can say, okay, all right, Lux, I think at some point in the near history, your church stamped out a pagan religion. This was within a generation. Maybe you were part of those purges. Did you participate or did you say no? And if they say I participated, you can say, cool, tell me about a village that you burned down, right? Then they can be like, oh, but I'm a good person. I can be like, okay, so Other paladins burned down this village. What did you do while that was happening? Why didn't you stop them? Right? You want to look at the things that the players assume about their characters or about the world and push on those things, right? So, the thing is you can get, and honestly, there have been sessions where I absolutely just want to stay in character creation forever. I just want to live in phase 11 where we introduce the character and the world, because that kind of unstructured creative energy is so much fun. Like, there's a reason why we designed a game that has 50 minutes to an hour of character and world building in the first session, because I love it so much. And I think that you get access to a player in a different way than if they showed up at the table with a 5th level warlock, right? If you go through this process together, you are going to get a new aspect of your players that maybe you haven't seen before if you haven't played a game like this. You're going to let them build a world together, and you're going to give them permission to be creative. And I think that's very, very important. And I think it's hard to come by sometimes in role-playing games. So it's a nice way to establish as part of the game, like, we are all building this together. And even when we move into the game in a more traditional, I say what's happening, I ask you what you do, and you respond, even once we get to that place, your creative input is still very important to me. It's important to the game, and it's important to me. So you're doing that establishment. So what I'll do, and let me just big up another author here. I've mentioned his name before, Johnstone Metzger, right? So Johnstone is a fantastic game designer, made Nightmares Underneath, made the Metamorphica, but also made a cut down, slightly edited version of Dungeon World, missing a lot of the like major details, but giving you enough that you can, it's like a travel version of Dungeon World called Truncheon World. It's a truncated Dungeon World. So if you don't already have this, go check out Truncheon World, because in the character creation section in Truncheon World, Johnstone gives a list of like 20 questions for each class that you can ask the players if you're stuck. I have my own, right? If you've watched the Waypoint one shot or you watched the Once More Onto the Dungeon World, you're going to see me repeating myself, right? Because I have a few questions in my toolkit that allow me to build the kinds of worlds that I enjoy, right? Because that's my job as the game master, is to ask questions during this introduction period, right? Draw the players into the world that we are all creating together, and do that yourself, right? I didn't do it here, but if you are recording your sessions, go back and look at the questions that you asked that you thought were useful. Go back and look at the questions that didn't really stand out, and start accumulating your own toolbox of questions for character creation, because you're going to get mileage out of them every time you do a one shot, right? So this process of introducing your character, this can take like 20 minutes to like a half an hour. Putting us almost to that 50-minute to an hour mark between the first bit of doing all the mechanical stuff, introducing all of the characters, asking all of this information about them, and then getting to the point where now you have all of this stuff. Now remember, and we've talked about this in general about role-playing games before, to make a game work, you basically need 3 things. You need protagonists, antagonists, and a situation. And by the end of character creation, you should be there. You should have the protagonist. That's the easy part. The players will do that for you. So you should have fairly fleshed out protagonists who exist in a world, right? The setting derives from the protagonist and the things they care about, right? In this case, we've got a village that they live in with a church to the god of light. We have an elven woods nearby. We derived the Sapphire Islands, where those came from. We'd started to build up a world. So we had a setting and we had protagonists, right? The protagonists generate the setting. I have some antagonists because I asked the players about like what's going wrong in this world, right? What is happening now? I found that tension. Antagonists are just tension personified, right? Like, and we've talked about this 100 times. I feel like this is my main thing for NPCs. NPCs are tension personified in the game, right? If the paladin tells you that the god of light is in the middle of trying to wipe out a pagan religion, the tension there is between the pagan religion and the paladin. personify that, right? Make it into a monster, make it into a cleric of the human god, right? Make it into an elven seer who is trying to protect the old ways, right? Create tension and then embody it. Give it something in the world. Make it real. Because tension in the background is irrelevant, right? Saying, the Harkonnens and the Atreides are at war over the fate of Arrakis is one thing, but saying the player characters belong to House Atreides and many of them have dead relatives killed by the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, that's real, right? Now there's an enemy. Now there's an antagonist. The antagonist has henchmen. The players have a purpose in the world, and you've created enough to do, at the very least, a one-shot. One strong antagonist, one strong piece of conflict is all you need. And we'll talk about rolling into play in just a second. So the last thing you need to do, and this is something the players do, is choose bonds. So for the players, all they have to do is just fill in the names. And honestly, doing bonds is for them. It's not for us as game masters. Now, we can listen for tension, but this interplayer tension is second tier to the stuff that we've built, the antagonism and the tension in step 11. If you get to step 12, all your job is to listen and nudge a little bit, right? Ask some more questions, but these questions help you clarify. And what you want to do is remember here that original statement about characters in Dungeon World. And I always tell the players this during character creation. Usually I'll do it at the beginning and I'll reinforce it during bonds. All you have to say is, remember, your characters might not be friends, but you all have a reason to work together. Think about that reason as you build your character and when you choose your bonds. Because if you don't reinforce that, if you don't tell them you are working together, you have a reason, come up with that reason as a group, bonds can turn into, well, I hate you and I want to kill you. And Dungeon World doesn't do PvP. Not very well. Generally in PvP, it just goes badly for everyone. So you want to reinforce the idea that they are maybe not friends, but they're like coworkers, or they are sworn to a sacred duty or whatever. And by now you should know what that is. You should know why Lux, the fervorous paladin, Deminor, the shapeshifter of the woods, and Oscar, the jovial bard, you should know by now why they're together. So bonds aren't there just to create the interactions between them. You've already started doing that. This is to fine-tune them and make them mechanical, right? There are a couple of bonds that are a little aggressive, or a couple of bonds that make declarative statements about other characters. Your job as the GM is to help move those questions to the right person. So, for example, the thief. I stole something from blank, right? So if I say, I stole something from Deminor, this is a moment to watch the players, right? Sometimes the thief will say, I stole that thing that you really care about or love. I stole your MacGuffin, right? That can be hard for the person being stolen from. You want to look at them and see how they respond. If they say, I guess so, it's very different than like, oh my God, that's perfect. My MacGuffin, like, and I'm searching for it, and I think that the bad guy took it, but you have it. Oh, that's great, right? Note those two responses. If the player seems like they're uncomfortable about a bond, turn it over to them, right? Say to them, is that true? Did they steal the MacGuffin, or did they steal something that they think is important? Because ultimately, the narrative control here is shared. It's a declarative statement by the character, but it might be a lie, right? The bond might be misinformed. I love the so-and-so always has my back when things go wrong. I always ask so-and-so, is that true? Do you really? Or are they wrong about this? Or blank owes me their life, whether they admit it or not. I always ask, do you admit it? Right? So listen to the bonds, again, looking for tension, but in this case, trying to make sure that that tension is interesting and that the players are bought into it. Your job is to read faces, to ask questions. And if learning someone's emotions, like by looking at their body language and their face is hard for you, if that's a challenge, because I know it can be for some people, don't be afraid to ask. How do you feel about that? Is that okay with you? Are you cool with that? Does that sound fun? All of those are really great questions to ask a player, right? Because that's fundamentally what this process is. We're all asking and engaging as humans who want to have a fun time playing this game together. So make sure that is something that you do. So once the bonds are done, if I am doing something that's not like a one shot on stage, or if I'm playing like a 2-hour game, usually I'll just rip through, right? I'll just rip right into like, all right, cool, let's go. Now that's scary because sometimes I'm not ready yet. Sometimes if we don't take a break, if we don't like go grab a smoke or like get a drink out of the vending machine or stretch your legs or whatever, if I don't take a break, I might not have everything I need, and I'm going to be juggling and be like, okay, all right, I just need a first scene, and I got to trust my brain to roll with it, and I got to trust to ask questions and play the game. If I can manage it, I will take 5 or I'll take 10. And even if I'm not like, everybody take a break, I'm going to sit here and brainstorm, I'll go outside and hang out while people have a smoke, or I'll like whatever. And I'm a little checked out because I'm not really taking a break. I'm grabbing a glass of water, but my brain is like, okay, percolating on the notes, thinking about the things that grabbed me. And then when I come back, I jump into it. So I suggest taking a 5-minute break at stage 13. So does the book. That's why we wrote it in the rules. But you may not have the opportunity to, or you might want to just jump into play because you've only got an hour and 15 minutes to play the game. So let's talk about turning all this crap, all these notes, into something interesting, right? That you can do in a one-shot. In a one-shot, all you need to do is resolve one thing, right? You're going to have way more threads than you will ever be able to pull, right? You're going to have a bunch of adversaries. You're going to have a complicated world. You're going to have a bunch of cool shit going on. You're going to have all these bonds. Everyone's got their own priorities, but hopefully you have found something, and this is a big part of asking those questions and being ready to play, find something that all of the characters are invested in, right? And you can do this by overlapping important stuff. If the fighter says, the monster that got away, the one monster I never defeated, right? I tried to kill him and he killed my mentor, my best friend, my husband, whatever, and he got away, the big tragic monster that got away, and another player says, a monster destroyed my village, guess what? It's the same fucking monster, right? Do not overextend. Overlap as much as you can. I hate, there's this wizard that I hate, and they're the worst. And then someone else says, well, there's a wizard that has the secret that will bring my dead sister back to life. Same wizard, right? Like you wanna cross this stuff over as much as you can. Pick the one thing. If you don't know where to start, pick the one thing that all 3 or all 4 or all 5 of your characters care about. That is what your one shot is about. That one thing. You may not completely resolve it, but that's the thing you want to care about. Everything else is just there for background color and for you to build into a larger campaign later. Those things will become fronts. So pick one thing and start as close to that thing as possible, right? This is the thing. We often want to start far away. We often want to start far away from success. We want to build up to it. We expect rising action before we get to that big climactic moment. Don't do that, right? The PureCon convention one-shot that I did in front of the audience, instead of saying, like, we asked a bunch of questions about a forgotten dwarven tomb temple. It was a tomb temple to the god of greed. And instead of saying, okay, I know what kind of monsters are in there, I know what kind of traps there might be, we know how to get there, instead of being like, all right, so you set out from the town on your way to the temple of Wummore so that you can loot it, I say, you're in front of the vault. Behind you lie the corpses of your enemies, right? You have suffered, you have struggled, you worked your way through, and you are now here at the end. Now, I stole this approach from Burning Wheel because this is basically how the sword does it, right? The sword is a one-shot scenario for the Burning Wheel where you play an adventuring party who has recovered a magic sword and basically has to resolve who gets to take it home, right? It's kind of a classic scenario for that game. And I think in this case, you want to start basically a scene or maybe 2 scenes away from the climax of your adventure. Because again, you've only got an hour or 2 hours, right? Think about how much time you have left. And that's how many, I figure any given scene takes about an hour to resolve. But that's what you want to do, right? So think about how close can I get to the big climax? If the players overcome the climactic thing too quickly, you can do the load-bearing boss thing. You can say, all right, how do you get out? And you can kind of back design the dungeon or whatever. But you want to start with a bang, right? Give them something that immediately gives them something to respond to, right? Say, this is happening. It is unignorable, and you must deal with it right now. And that's the situation, right? That situation, you might be able to resolve it in a single session, but focus, right? Don't try to do everything at once. Bring in things from their background, show them that the conversation that you had mattered, right? Bring in those adversaries, bring in the things that the characters invented themselves, right? Bring in the fighter's rival, bring in someone who would question the paladin's authority, bring in a menacing spirit of the woods, right? Find ways to overlap that stuff, give the players something to do. If you want to do like a fight scene, which Dungeon World likes fighting. If you want to do a fight scene, remember, it takes longer and has more rolls than usual. Now, I usually start with a fight because that's the game, right? There's lots of fighting monsters, and that's fun. We have moves for fighting, and we want to try them out. I love jumping right into a fight, but it doesn't have to be a fight. It could be a chase. It could be a deadly climb up a windswept, icy mountainside, whatever. But let them engage the mechanics. Give them lots of stuff to do. And honestly, and this is something that, I don't know, you're going to need to know your players, but I love ending one-shots on a cliffhanger, right? I love saying, okay, you've overcome this thing, but wait, there's more, roll credits, right? I love ending on a cliffhanger. It's a little bit of a trick if you want to encourage your players to play Dungeon World again. Now, I get this a lot where people say, how do I encourage people who are mostly Pathfinder players or who are mostly Dungeons and Dragons players? How do I get them to like try out Dungeon World, right? And obviously you ask them if they want to do that. And if they agree, if they say yes, then you want to bring them in for that one shot and you do it and that's it. But you can also, if you cliffhanger the one shot, you can invite them to come back. So I kind of like ending on one shots or ending one shots on cliffhangers. That stuff is fun for me, but it might also be like, you know, you can't get satisfaction, but it's a one shot, right? There's no permanent satisfaction to be had. There's all these threads anyway. So give them something they can succeed at, and then lead them to that cliffhanger, right? And give them something for the second session. Now, one hint, and this is something that I will try to remind myself of. You want to give the players in a one shot as many opportunities as you can to get experience. Right? Now, one of these things they'll do on their own. They're going to fail rolls on their own, and that'll be fun, right? That's always a fun experience for you and for them. But they're going to want to try to resolve a bond. They're going to want to try to do their alignment thing. They're going to want to do the 3 Dungeon World reward things, right? They're going to want to learn something about the world, which is impossible not to do in the first session. They're going to want to defeat a meaningful enemy, right? Overcome a meaningful foe, and they're going to want to recover some treasure. So try to incorporate those things into your game, especially those 3, right? Give them a foe to overcome, give them a MacGuffin to recover. That's what Dungeon World is about. That's what all the moves allow them to do. They're going to try to resolve a bond. They're going to try to play their alignment. And that's why at the end of a one shot, as a kind of like, thanks for coming, everybody, let's reward you with some points. I will sit down and I'll do the thing, right? We'll go through the questions and I'll give out experience, because again, you might get to that point where you're like, oh my gosh, Lux, you did such a great job. You've got 8 experience. If we play again, you can level up to level 2. If we play again. Right? So you want to kind of like lure them in. And if they agree, right? If they take the bait and they want to play again, how do you turn that one shot into a campaign, right? Now, the game has a tool for that. It has fronts, right? And you're already going to have a bunch of stuff that could be a front. And what you want to look for is, what is the main thing? What did we leave? What did we leave cliffhangering, right? What's hanging off that cliff? What didn't get resolved in the first session? That's our front that is already in the midst of action, right? The haunting of Argent Lake, the escape from the tomb, the defeat of the rival, those things are already a front in motion. You already started those. So create those as fronts according to the game, and then create as many more fronts as you want based on the loose threads, right? Did a player offhandedly mention that an elven prince was assassinated by a human and that created some tension between them? There's a front, right? Did somebody mention that they came from a cursed homeland? That's a front. You've been creating tension all the way through, right? You've been looking for that tension. You've been embodying that tension in either people or places, right? Or monsters. I guess monsters are people. NPCs and places. And you've created all of these potential situations. And all you have to do is formalize them as fronts so that in the next session, you can continue. You actually don't really have to do any prep because you can continue off of your cliffhanger, finish resolving that, and as you do, introduce your other fronts. And then from there, it's simple. You carry on with the game, following your agenda, following your principles, and making moves. Do those three things, run the game, build your fronts, and you're going to be able to get another 10 or 12 sessions just out of that first session prep, right? Things will change. Fronts will come and go. Characters will get new abilities. You're going to keep learning about the world because that's one of the three things they get experience for, right? But this one page is enough for you to run a 10 to 12 session game of Dungeon World. This is enough momentum to get you going. Now, a lot of this stuff, the structural stuff predominantly, right? Not so much the mechanical stuff, obviously. A lot of this stuff can be applied to other games. Other games will have their own rule for prep. They'll have their own stuff that they want you to do. So do those, right? Don't ignore what a game tells you to do. Definitely do it. But things like fronts, things like asking questions, things like letting the players create that space that you can all play in, coming to the table with the empty mind, right? Ready to receive creative content. Do all of those things in 5th edition. You can absolutely do that, right? And if you want an example of this, on my YouTube channel, just look at any of my prep for Court of Swords. I use fronts in Court of Swords all the time. And when a player makes a new character that is of a class or a race that we haven't seen before, I let them contribute to the universe. Because that's how you get buy-in, and that's how you prevent yourself from having to do all the work. So hopefully this structure, this style, will allow you to jump in and play a one-shot of Dungeon World. You can do it now, for all that it matters. Like right now, you could go find some people. You could play Dungeon World. The game is available on the Roll20 Compendium, so all the rules are built into Roll20. If you want to play online, you could buy a PDF, you could buy a book, whatever. Go play Dungeon World. Do a one-shot. It's easier than you think. And just because I don't do any prep doesn't mean that you can't come to the table with some ideas. If you do, just be ready to let those ideas bend and shape themselves a little bit to fit what your fellow players are prioritizing. So this has been episode number 81 of Office Hours, a very special Dungeon World one-shot tutorial of Office Hours. I love doing one-shots of Dungeon World. I think it's really fun. Some of the most amused I've ever been during a game have been in these things. So I hope that you can derive some fun out of it as well. So get out there, go play a role-playing game. And if you have questions for regular episodes of Office Hours, you can submit them on my website, www.adam-koebel.com/office-hours, or just click the Office Hours link, fill out the form, submit your questions, and we will return next time with more Office Hours. And if you were watching this on YouTube by now, the PureCon edition of Office Hours should be available on YouTube as well, in case you missed it on my channel when we aired it from Poland. So yeah, that's it. Thank you so much for coming, everybody. I hope this has been helpful, and I hope you play Dungeon World. Not just because I wrote it and I want you to buy my game, but because I think it's fun, which is why we designed it. So if you haven't already, go check it out, and we will see you next time. Thanks for coming.